great to be back, actually. It's great to be back after quite a prolonged Nowruz break. It's good to be back for 3 more sessions through the month of June. I'd just like to say hello, anyone who has just joined us, and a big warm welcome, B'khair Hatun and B'khair Bain. My name's Christine Robbins. I'm actually speaking to you from England, from the Centre for Kurdish Studies at the University of Exeter.
Yes, good morning. My name is Marie Labrosse, and I'm the director of Kashkul, the Center for Arts and Culture at the American University of Iraq, Slimani, but I'm speaking to you from California today.
Lovely. So we're resuming these conversations, which are on the theme of curating Kurdishness, art, culture, and the archive in Kurdistan and beyond. Those of you who've listened before know that we're aiming to capture the huge range of creativity, of making new expressions of knowledge, and of preserving older, treasured knowledge that we see amongst people living in Kurdistan and coming from Kurdistan. And this gives us access to a really wide range of subjects: poetry, art, sculpture, music today, and also how people curate and preserve their own precious cultural knowledge. Our guests include creatives, scholars, and artists of all ages from different communities who use different languages. Now, Exeter University's Centre for Kurdish Studies is part of our Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, which is the UK's largest single multidisciplinary department focusing on the Middle East and the Islamic world more widely. Our Centre for Kurdish Studies was founded in 2006, and since then, through our MA and PhD programs, we've seen the emergence of some early career scholars who've really been changing the paradigms in Kurdish studies. I have to mention Dr. Dengî Ekici, because his beautiful monograph arrived on my doorstep just a few days ago, which I'm very excited about. It's a great monograph.
Congratulations, Dr. Dengî.
Yeah, yes. Yes, you probably remember Dr. Dengî. And there is also Dr. Marie Labrosse herself, also Dr. Argun Charkar, Dr. Alan Hassanian, Dr. Farangis Qaderi, many, many more who have done and are doing PhDs with us. As for taught courses, if you've listened to us before, you'll know already that as from 2021, this coming September, we are once again offering our MA in Kurdish Studies, which will offer the chance to engage with a huge range of resources and to develop your own research interests through guided and independent readings, through presentations, creative project work, and of course, through a dissertation. So you may have heard some of Exeter's other online webinars. We have a few seminar series, webinar series. There is another one on Kurdish studies, which is organized in conjunction with the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, and that's organized by Dr. Joanna Bochenska and our colleague, Dr. Farangis Qaderi at the Exeter end. And our series of conversations that I organized with Dr. Marie, our series celebrates the great working partnership that Exeter has with Kashkul and with AUIS. We do have a huge area of common ground in our work on the preservation of knowledge and culture. So we're interested in oral history, endangered cultures, lost literatures, and in translating Kurdish texts for a non-Kurdish speaking public. And most recently, we're developing our interest in archives and in decolonized archival processes. So we wanted to celebrate Kurdish culture and the possibilities for young people to follow their interests, their talents and their passions into graduate studies and into their lifetime careers.
And that's exactly what Kashkul exists to do. We exist to support emerging and established artists, translators, and researchers in the Slimani region and the larger Middle East. Over the last 5 years, we've translated over 1,000 pages of Kurdish poetry into English, placing these translations in respected outlets such as Modern Poetry and Translation, World Literature Today, Words Without Borders, Poetry Daily, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. We have a small but dynamic staff of 5 who works together as a collaborative, supporting each other's research, writing, and translation. And each semester in non-COVID times, we welcome artists and researchers and residents from around the world, such as John, who's with us today. We also have a very healthy internship program. Anyone who's interested in that, please let us know. Easier to contact Sarwar Taha. I can leave his email in the chat. He's my wonderful assistant director at Kashkul. Our current research projects at Kashkul include the collecting, editing, and selected translation of Piramerd's prose. We do that project in collaboration with Gene Archive. And in collaboration with Christine and Zaidan Khalaf and Imad Bashar, we are also expanding our oral history endeavors into Shingal. We've been working mostly in Mosul, but we're expanding now. And as Christine said, we remain very interested in how archives can actually be of use to people, can be methods of empowerment, methods of redirecting and inverting traditional power structures. And actually an article about that is coming out in the new issue of Tripwire, should be out in a couple of weeks. And the new issue of Tripwire is entirely about radical approaches to the archive. So we're very excited to have that article come out. But I have to say, we're even more excited today to host John Bullock, who joined us at Kashkul just a couple years ago as a visiting researcher, and whose project has deeply intrigued me ever since.
Okay, so I've got the job of introducing John, which is a bit crazy because you know him so well, Marie, and you've worked with him. But John,
I thought that would embarrass him even more, Christine, to have
right,
to do all of these incredible things.
And they are incredible. John is a PhD candidate in ethnomusicology at the University of Chicago. That is a really good ethnomusicology school, folks. And his dissertation is titled Resounding Tradition: Iraqi Kurdish Music as a Critique of Colonial Power from 1923 to the Present. Now, in his dissertation, John examines key moments in the history of Iraqi Kurdish musical practice and the contemporary transmission of this history in the light of the imposition of colonial power across the region throughout the 20th century, while he's also suggesting that Iraqi Kurdish music might be understood as a productive critique of what he calls colonial logics of time and place. Now, John's dissertation research, which includes both archival and ethnographic work, has been generously supported by the Department of Music and the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago, the Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship Program, the American Musicological Society, the Society for Asian Music, the Association for Recorded Sound Collections, and in 2019 by Kashkul, in partnership with the American University of Iraq, Soleimani. So a lot of people want John's work to be published and well known, don't they? So that's great. Most recently, John was awarded a Franke Institute for the Humanities Dissertation Completion Fellowship, which will allow him to complete the dissertation by summer 22. Well, I've said it to I don't know how many people, John, so no pressure there. John has presented his research at numerous conferences, in several publications, and in undergraduate classrooms as a lecturer at the University of Chicago. And I'm really happy that he's going to tell us about it as well. So I was very excited when I heard that we were going to have a conversation with John, because over a lot of years in Kurdish studies, I've discovered that some of the most exciting and groundbreaking research about language, text, identity, gender, memory, all those subjects, it hides itself under the mantle of ethnomusicology. I'm thinking about great work by people like Estelle Ami de la Bretèque, Argun Çakır, Yanis Kanakis, Melissa Bilal, many others. And the issue of radio as a vehicle of memory and identity is also really important, because so many of my own oral history interviewees over the years have looked back on Kurdish radio as an early inspiration, and sometimes they even describe it as a light in the darkness. So I'm really interested in John's work and finding out more about it.
And on that note, John, I wonder if you could, just to get us oriented, say a little bit about ethnomusicology as a field for those in our audience today who may be a little less familiar with it. Christine obviously is very, but for those who may be just new to the field.
Absolutely. Becher bein, ewaratan bash, zor chosh halim, im ewaraya legoltan kasabakem. Thank you so much for not only that wonderful introduction to the field and myself, and I'll point out that that long list just means that like I'm indebted to this many people. I like to say no one researches alone. And so thank you so much to those on the list, to the scholars even maybe watching today whose own work has been incredibly influential for me. I started this PhD program with very little knowledge about anything Kurdish, and you all have helped be my guides, so thank you. Thank you also for this question about ethnomusicology. I think this is an important one, not least because along with institutions or disciplines or fields come institutional restraints and challenges and opportunities. So I think it's important to situate our work that way. And for ethnomusicology in particular, this is a relatively new field. The term was first used in print in 1950 by a scholar called Jaap Kunst. Before then, there was a field generally known as comparative musicology. And this was sort of where ethnomusicology came from. Obviously, this earlier idea of comparative musicology, on the one hand, it was made possible by expanding colonial power. And so as, pardon me, you'll hear a train passing by. I'm going to mute myself for just a moment.
I actually have to say that trains passing is one of my favorite noises in the world, John. So don't worry about that for a moment.
You would be very happy here. But yeah, so I was saying comparative musicology really was reliant on the expanding of colonial power, increased access, economic means availability, and as scholars in Europe saw increasingly new to them musical systems and instruments, they began processes of comparing these on a scholarly basis. Of course, at the time, this led to a sort of hierarchy where Western music was seen as the sort of pinnacle and everything else was compared to Western music. But of course, we, as a field, like to think that we've moved on from this perspective and have learned much from many fields. And so in a way, it's also important to point out that to many people, ethnomusicology seems like a kind of blend of both musicology and anthropology. And of course, anthropologists, you know, even though they may not call themselves ethnomusicologists, many contributions of anthropologists to the field of ethnomusicology. One of those early on, 1964, in his book, The Anthropology of Music, Alan Merriam was the first to sort of describe ethnomusicology as the study of music in culture. In 1973, John Blacking, another anthropologist, published How Musical is Man, where he described music as humanly organized sound. So a lot of even the basic tenets that we sort of hold today as ethnomusicologists stem from our relation to the field of anthropology and putting these different kinds of thinking into conversation with one another. I will say the most sort of recent definition of ethnomusicology, there's an ethnomusicologist named Bruno Nettel who published a book called The Study of Ethnomusicology, first in 1983, later editions in 2005 and 2015. But Nettel mentions 5 basic characteristics of ethnomusicology. The first, owing again from Merriam, is that it's the study of music in culture. The second, it uses a comparative but also egalitarian perspective. And this again is sort of acknowledging the troublesome past in some ways and figuring out how we can work toward equity. Number 3, it's study with the use of field work. So field work, ethnographic research is a common component among much ethnomusicological research. Number 4, it's the study of all the musical manifestations of a society, not just those considered to be high or low class, for example. And number 5, it's aimed at helping the world's musicians and peoples. And this certainly, of course, is a lofty aim and one that we hope our work will do.
Thank you, John. What a fantastic overview. Oh, Christine, I think you might be muted.
Yeah, I think I might. So may I ask a question which is really about the development of Kurdish reading versus listening publics, which is built by radio throughout the 20th century. How did that Kurdish listening public grow up?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is, again, a very important question. The idea of reading publics, of course, is we're drawing primarily from Benedict Anderson and his work called Imagined Communities. And Anderson posits that a reading public, the formation of a reading public, is a key step toward the crystallization of nationalism or national consciousness in its modern sense. What's interesting is when we try to look at various Kurdish national movements, for example, through this lens, we run into a little bit of issues. Not least because with the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, Kurds find themselves in nations in which they're not the majority. So in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And so it's a certain kind of moment of rupture in 1923. And this would impact the ways in which Kurds writ large, Kurdish society would have access to the kinds of technologies and processes needed to form a reading public. So, for example, some of the things that delayed this, delayed the large-scale development of a Kurdish reading public include the fact that, in every nation of which Kurds became a part after 1923, at various points, organized linguistic and or cultural activity was considered illegal in many cases. Another factor includes high rates of illiteracy, which in many cases, in Iraq in particular, was directly tied toward British colonial policy. In the years following 1923, the delayed development of a Kurdish economic middle class, and of course, the challenges of language standardization without state support, any sort of state support for these efforts. So these are factors, and I'll say these are all acknowledged and sort of expounded on by the late Amir Hassanpour, his work, Language and Nationalism in Kurdistan. So these are some of the reasons or some of the factors he suggests that were responsible for the delayed development, again, of a reading public. Compare that, on the other hand, with radio and the formation of a listening public. Ethnomusicologist Stephen Blum and Amir Hassanpour in the late 90s, I believe, wrote an article in which they claimed that radio is the single most important factor in the development of a Kurdish listening public. So again, even while the development of a reading public is being delayed, radio is laying the foundations in not only in Iraq, but in all the various regions of Kurdistan in various ways for the foundation of a listening public. And this, radio, in one sense, this is because radio was reliant on transnational networks, not just in terms of acquiring technology and things like this, but if we look at the period before radio, the period in which gramophone and phonograph recording companies are sort of trotting across the globe trying to record as much as they can, there were already some transnational alliances and networks in place that once radio was established, it sort of built on these in certain ways. And so even within Iraq, for example, as the British colonial government, will say before 1932, was interested in sort of slowing down the idea of Kurdish reading public, Iraqi Kurds at certain points could turn to radio broadcasts in Kurdish coming from other places. Yerevan and parts of the Soviet republics, and later from Tehran and from Jaffa in the 1940s, from Cairo. So there's an interesting sense in which this Kurdish listening public really spanned national borders in ways that would become really interesting, not just politically, but also musically. And we'll talk about some of those a little later, I think. It's also, of course, radio becomes such an interesting factor in terms of the formation of a listening public, because radio revealed really important power imbalances in the region. So, for example, when Iraq establishes its radio, it's at first in 1936 a single medium wave transmitter. And in the 1950s, Iraq would beg the US and other nations for help in attaining higher power transmitters because of broadcasts coming from Egypt criticizing the Baghdad Pact that Nouri Es-Said, prime minister at the time, was in support of. So it's not just a matter of folks being able to tune into different stations, but also the sort of broader political and colonial implications of these.
Thank you. I was very yeah, I was particularly interested that by what you said about how this sort of complicates the narrative of print capitalism that Benedict Anderson puts forward. I do think one of the great things about Kurdish studies is that the examples so often give you something to challenge those theoreticians with, because everything is always, quite complex, and the language policies were so repressive that it was extremely difficult to develop reading publics. Well, everywhere except the Soviet Union. We all know that there were conditions around that there. So thank you for that, John. That's really great. I think Marie, you have a question.
I do. One of our colleagues and a previous guest on this series, Zeydan Khalaf, a poet and translator, and now our colleague on the Shingal Lives project from Shingal, he's spoken about how democratizing radio was, which is something that you were just touching on, John, and the opportunities it provided for Kurds and other minorities in Iraq to communicate and share culture with one another. What are your thoughts on the history of radio in Iraq? You've taken us back pretty far, but looking more toward World War II, and then digging into this relationship radio has to colonialism, colonialist aims, but also the inversion of the colonialist power structure. And then how have different populations taken advantage of the medium of radio over time? Sorry, that's really unfair. That was 8 questions in one. Please feel free to winnow that down however you need to tell us something that you're excited about.
Sounds good. I'll just pick my favorites. So as you mentioned, it's really important to think about the fact that radio was sort of coming up again. Iraq's first broadcast come in 1936. And so as time goes by, the events leading up to World War II become very important in consideration of Kurdish radio, not just in Iraq, but elsewhere. I think now, by the way, is probably a great time to explain the title a little bit, the first part of the title of this conversation, Dengî Gelî Kurdistan. In the city of Slemani, which is where I've done my ethnographic and archival work, and also, by the way, thank you, Tijin Archive and the Kurdish Heritage Institute. Without both of those, I wouldn't have nearly as much rich material, so thank you to them. But in the city of Slemani, there's a museum called Amna Suraka, and it was essentially the headquarters in the city of Saddam Hussein's intelligence operations, and many describe it as a torture chamber. It's now a museum, and in this museum, there are quite a few exhibits related to music, whether musical instruments, musical notation. And one of those is an old Philips shortwave radio. And on the plaque next to the Philips shortwave radio, it says, Era Dengî Gelî Kurdistana, Era Dengî Shorashi Kurdistana, Era Dengî Kurdistana. So here's the voice of the people of Kurdistan. Here's the voice of Kurdistan's revolution. Here is the voice of Kurdistan. So this is a very interesting claim, obviously, for radio, and it relates really well to some of what Marie and Christine have already mentioned about individuals' attitudes toward radio and the possibilities it provided. Later, of course, it would provide, secret radio stations would provide news about the movement of Iraqi troops so that Kurdish troops were free to move elsewhere. So there's all these interesting angles that are sort of tied to radio, and it represents all these things. As I mentioned before, though, we can't just start with the history of radio. We have to go back a bit and consider the history of recording technology writ large. As I mentioned, this is very tied to the history of colonialism at the time. There were agreements, for example, between certain recording companies, gramophone companies, about which parts of the world they would take in their quest to record local musics. And so all of these politics became really easily and quickly involved in the history of recording at first. Then when radio was founded in Iraq, even once the Kurdish station gives its first broadcast in 1939, 3 years after the founding of Radio Baghdad, we're told that the first broadcast consisted of 1 or 2 records of Kurdish music and news related to World War II. See, I'll get back to World War II. So radio, for the first few years of its existence, at least at Radio Baghdad, was not capable of broadcasting music live. And so they relied on these records. And so this is why I keep saying, this is a very important moment, the recording industry. And this also bears extreme implications of local politics. So for example, after 1923, when performing in Kurdish became illegal in Turkey, singers came to Baghdad to record. So we have, for example, Muhammad Arif Jaziri or Jazrawi, whose recordings are still very popular today. He comes to Baghdad to record. So as political situations get incredibly tense for Kurdish performers, we find many of them coming to Baghdad. And so we have not only Baghdad and Iraq as an important center for recording, but also this means that listeners of radio were being exposed to all sorts of regional genres and variants that they perhaps had not been as familiar with before. So Laoix, for example, from the Batinan region, Muhammad Arif Jaziri records several of these. Earlier, Kawi Saha records several of these, one even praising Sheikh Mahmoud, which is really interesting. But again, all of these histories come into play. And so by the time we get to World War II, the British are firmly established in Iraq, even though there's now a British installed monarchy, due to fears of Nazi propaganda being broadcast in Arabic. And I will add that Iraq's king at the time of the founding of Radio Baghdad, Ghazi, was fascinated by radio. He had his own little radio station at the palace, at least for a while. He was the only announcer. But records say he would even sometimes read reports provided directly by the Nazis in Germany. So the British fears, of course, over this, something must be done. And so what their solution is to establish a Kurdish station in Jaffa, in Palestine, in sometime in 1941 or 42. And so the British come to Iraq. They say Iraq will be the best place to get station staff for various reasons. And so they end up selecting three Kurdish cultural icons. One of them was Abdullah Goran, the poet. He worked at the radio station in Jaffa. Another was Rafiq Jalak, a singer who worked at the station. And the third was Remzi Qazaz. So even again, as the situation in Iraq for Kurdish radio was not so great at the time, just a few minutes a day, Kurdish cultural icons and figures are being trained at radio stations in other places. And again, these are tied directly to Nazi fears. The French, or fears of the Nazis, the French would establish Kurdish broadcasting in Beirut a little later. So this gives us a sense, I hope, of the ways all of these are really sort of connected.
Marie, do you have any follow-ups to that question?
I wonder if we could hear a little bit more about the way that it's interesting that, radio stations initially could not broadcast live music. They had to actually record. So the recording industry actually had a significant bearing on the radio industry. That makes complete sense once you say it. Everything is obvious once you know the answer, right? But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the recording industry worked in Iraq for different minorities, for the country at large, and how that really came to bear on national radio in Iraq at the time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've mentioned already that sort of the big names, the Victor Gramophone talking machine company, some of these were sort of racing across the globe to establish markets, essentially, and to sort of, I compare them to sonic colonizers in the dissertation, with sort of means and access that the people that are recording don't have. And it's interesting, by the way, to think that many of those who traveled to Baghdad to record did so in those early days, often at their own expense, or for one meal, I'm told. And this sort of also meant for instrumentalists in local towns, those who would normally accompany singers, because the journey was so expensive and prohibitive, the instrumentalists themselves stayed behind. And even once radio itself was able to broadcast music, they often had their own station musicians. Many of these were Jewish in Iraq, particularly before 1950 in those early years. And so this also, by the way, adds to the sort of rich complexity that is Iraqi Kurdish music. You can't talk about Iraqi Kurdish music without talking about these musicians and their varied contributions. But again,
I think that Halaki would be so happy to hear you say that. I think he would feel that his archive at KHI had actually really done something. That's beautiful to hear, John. Sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
No, it's great. It's great. And I'll throw in a story here because I love telling it. There's a famous Jewish performer named Dengî Jamal, a female singer, and she married, she had lots of records apparently, and she married a local officer from Slemani who told her he didn't want her to sing anymore. And he went into one of the tea houses and smashed all her records. But again, this is just one really interesting story, and her records survived, by the way. He didn't destroy them all, just the ones in that tea house. So there are all sorts of really interesting characters and people with all sorts of backgrounds that are contributing to this growing sense of what it means to be, what Kurdish music means, at least insofar as it's being broadcast from the radio. So, but again, in addition to these sort of big major international recording companies, we also see the rise of lots of smaller local companies. Maqsood was an early example who specialized in Arabic recordings. There's also Baidaphone, which was founded in Lebanon, Chakmakchi, which was founded in Baghdad, originally as a seller of electronics, but later in the 50s began producing their own records. And so in a way, the sort of spreading technology enabled by the sort of sonic colonization, also enables local responses and local companies to form and able to record the singers they want to record. So we also see some changes happening in this way, and different sort of smaller local centers that are working against, in some ways, the bigger companies. There was another aspect to your question. I feel I've forgotten.
No, I think you're doing wonderfully. I want to be sure that I turn it back over to Christine here.
Okay, thank you, Marie. Yeah, I would like to turn to the music itself because I happen to know that John has got a couple of short pieces of music, a couple of short recordings up his sleeve. And I was wondering if you could talk us through the music that you've brought with you, and perhaps use it to speak to the relationship between Kurdish and other musics in the region in the 20th century.
Thank you so much. Again, this is, when we look at a lot of research on certain kinds of musics, doesn't have to be Kurdish, you can fill in the blank. There's often this sort of search for a kind of purity, authenticity, and not to say that, these terms are not meaningful and constructed in very important ways to people, but, when we look at the music itself, there's constant processes of borrowing and reworking and re-remembering. And so this is sort of an aspect that I've become interested in for a different part of the dissertation, which has to do with how Iraqi Kurdish musicians today are looking back on this sort of legacy of the founding of an Iraqi Kurdish or broader Kurdish form of music. And so one of the things I'm interested in doing is sort of taking songs and tracing their lineage, so to speak. And so it struck me earlier this year, I was watching some sort of live broadcast, I believe it was from Slemani, and a singer named Bokan Helrami sings a song called Pam Balay Toza Toza, or Bom Balay Toza Toza. You'll see it both ways. And it was interesting because as he talks about the song he's about to perform, he says, this song was performed by Hassan Zirek and also by Adnan Karim, and I'm more influenced by Adnan Karim's version. Then he goes on and sings the song. So of course, I had to go find these various versions. And I find the version by Adnan Karim, produced probably in the 90s. If anyone has an exact date for his release, feel free to share. But so there's this version. Hassan Zirek is a really interesting and important figure in Kurdish music history. He was born in 1921, died in 1972. And originally was born in Rojhelat, eastern Iranian Kurdistan. And it's interesting, he comes to work and record singing for Radio Baghdad in 1953. After the 1958 revolution, he flees Iraq and goes to work for the radio station in Tehran. So he's got this long history of working for radio, but that's not necessarily the part people remember him for most these days. These days, folks talk a lot about the fact that he is said to have recorded as many as 1,000 songs in his lifetime, which is incredible. He was known to also be a poet and to compose lyrics and melodies on the spot. He was also incredibly unashamed about borrowing melodies and, all sorts of other musical aspects from local musics. He even performed occasionally in Azeri, in Turkish, in Persian, and he also borrowed Azeri melodies, Turkish melodies, and gave them Kurdish lyrics. So one of the reasons I highlight this is because it's very, again, when we sort of want to look for pure musics, there's often the unintended side effect of siloing a particular group and of sort of limiting the options that were actually available to musicians and to other cultural figures who, again, were crossing national boundaries and really working against colonialism in important ways. And so I finally, thanks to the help of some scholars and some musician friends in Slimani, realized even this version by Hasan Zirek was a borrowed melody from the Egyptian diva songstress Kulthum. And there's a song that she performed called Renili Shwe Shwe. And it was composed in the 1940s for a film that she starred in called Salama. The composer was Zakaria Ahmed. So here's this tune from the 1940s composed for a film. And Hasan Zirek takes this tune and gives it Kurdish lyrics. And, it's still being sung today, although its lineage not necessarily always traced back to Egypt. But I want us to think a little bit musically about what this process of borrowing might look like. And again, just because there's it's a futile search for pure musics, that's not to say, again, that Zirek wasn't a sort of incredible master of taking pre-existing materials and working them into something more familiar. So the two sonic examples we'll have, the first, I just want to play about 30 seconds or so of the version performed by Kulthum, mainly to get the melody of it in your head. The melody of the song will stay the same. The words, of course, will not be in Arabic, but in Kurdish. But also what's interesting, when we get to the recording by Zirek, and I have to admit, this is kind of an unusual recording. It may be the first recording of this song. I'm told this recording's from 1954. The scholar in me says that wants me to tell you that I haven't verified that yet. But at any rate, this is an early recording. In later recordings, even of Zirek's of this song, it sounds very, very similar to Kulthum's version. Yet in what may be the first recording, it actually sounds quite different. So he starts, for example, there's an introductory instrumental solo. And then he goes on to improvise on a poem, not to the tune, again, of this melody, not this melody that he's borrowed. And so you'll hear something at the start of the recording that sounds completely unrelated to the song that's to follow. And also what's really interesting about it, if I have musicologists following along, perhaps, originally the song is set in Maqam Rast. But what's really interesting, Hasan Zirek does not perform, at least in this recording, in Maqam Rast. A musician friend in Slimani tells me, and it's the subject of ongoing discussion, that he's actually performing it in a Persian mode, dasht. And so you'll notice that, again, there are these really interesting differences. And to me, this is not a message saying that, Zirek just took what he could from whatever, but again, really showing the mastery and the ways in which he considered himself not just, a Kurdish musician, but also Dashti, yes, thank you. Not just considering himself a Kurdish musician in very limited circles, but really taking what he could find from other regional musical systems. And he's not the only example, but he's the only example we have time for today. So at this point, we'll play these two clips.
We can't hear. I don't know if you can hear. I can't hear the clips.
Thank you. Let me try this again.
John, another option might be for you to send those links to me in the chat, and I can share my screen and I can play them.
Let's do that. I'll send you the first and then copy the second. So just about 30 seconds of the first is good, just enough again for us to sort of hear the melody.
Okay, give me 1 second here. All right.
غني لي شوي شوي غني لي وخد عيني غني لي شوي شوي غني لي وخد عيني.
So again, this gives you a chance to hear the melody, hold that in your head or your ears, and then again, we'll move to the second recording, and you'll notice again that it takes a while before that melody comes in, but I'll talk just a bit more about why that might be afterward.
And John, I'm sorry, do I have that second link from you?
You do now, I think.
Still no. There we go.
there's our melody. It took us a couple minutes to get there. And again, we see what's coming first. And I'll note that in the original, again, composed by Zakaria Ahmed, this was actually in a light genre of Arabic music. We sort of see a different sort of take on that in this version by Hasan Zirek, where there's an introductory period that's not entirely unlike what we see in a genre called Maqami Kurdi. Kurdish maqams often, at least as far as I've encountered them in Sorani-speaking regions, they're a performance genre that share a form or structure, a similar form or structure as that of Iraqi maqam. And so again, we have an introductory period. There's a closer relationship between voice and instrument at the start. And then we have a pause and the start of a metered section. So I wish we had time to listen to the whole recording. There's also a chorus that comes in and joins. It's a great recording. Yes, this again, I hope sort of shows us an example of the kinds of sort of musical collaboration and reworking and reimagining that were taking place in part because of radio.
Thank you so much. It was great to hear that. And it was great to hear how the first part was actually surprisingly long before we got to the we got to the melody. And it's also, I think your work is quite unusual in the way that it does contextualize Kurdish music and place it within this wider context. It's very helpful for us when we're trying to understand what's going on, really. I think that I'm going to pass us back to Marie for the next question.
Yeah, John, it was really lovely to hear you talk about, in a way, how cosmopolitan Hasan Zirak's approach was to music itself. And I see that a lot in the 19th century as well with the poets, where in some ways the definition of Kurdishness in the 19th century was to be masters of all. So, you know, having delayed what have you from the first half of our conversation today certainly didn't delay Kurdish artistry at all. In fact, it may have energized certain flexibility and creativity in it. I wondered if just to close out our prepared questions today, because we have a few piling up from the audience, and everyone, please do feel free to leave your comments either in the YouTube section of comments. We have a staff member monitoring those, or feel free to leave it in the Q&A function within Zoom. But to take us out, John, from the prepared questions, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how radio has changed. Christine and I have been talking a lot with our Yazidi colleagues about how the oral traditions have changed just with the advent of social media. And how that's been such a big event. And I wondered, you know, the evolution of television, especially with Saddam's embracing of television, and then the advent of social media. Where is radio today?
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question, and one I admittedly am still thinking about and still sort of following down all the leads, so to speak. And I think it's a really important question. I think, first of all, I should probably note that, you know, alongside the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 came the destruction of Radio Baghdad and its archives. And so this, on the one hand, is an area that, you know, I've found difficult to find access, and not just me, of course, other scholars as well. And there's an entire generation of announcers and other sorts of staff members who worked at Kurdish Radio Baghdad, and yet they're dying. You know, they're members of an older generation, and the knowledge that they have feels very elusive in terms of being able to reach out and to sort of, you know, reconstruct these histories before they're gone altogether in a certain kind of way. So with that, I'll of course say thank you to the several folks who have sat through interviews with me talking about radio, and me asking all sorts of weird, specific questions about radio. You may find it interesting, by the way, that the Kurdish section of Radio Baghdad shared floor space with the Arabic section, all the other sort of foreign languages were together, and yet Kurdish, the Kurdish section shared space. So, but again, these sorts of even just little details like this, it's important work that I and others, again, who I know are working on this topic, are sort of tracking down. It's also interesting to think now about the relation of, when we talk about 19th century poets, for example, and musicians, we talk about patronage, we talk about the Erdalans and the Babans, and yet with contemporary radio, I think in a way, we got to follow the money, right? To sort of understand, again, this radio still reveals power imbalances. Even as it in some ways democratizes, it also tends to reinforce certain hierarchies. And so this is something nowadays that we sort of need to think carefully about, I think. Your question about the internet and social media is a great one. I sort of chuckle because when I first decided, before entering the PhD program, I actually had a question of, a very simple question: what does Kurdish music sound like? And so I met some Kurdish friends in Nashville, Tennessee, here in the US, and every single one of them told me, because I went to Nashville looking for cassettes, CDs, something, and they said, what? I don't understand. Why don't you just go on the internet? So this is a response I've gotten several times. If you want fine Kurdish music, go on the internet. And so in a way, I think it's important to acknowledge this role of the internet as a way of kind of, on one hand, preservation. We talk about the importance of radio. This is not unrelated to people's personal archives, like Dr. Marlene Schaefers has written about, and have heard many stories of people burying cassette tapes underground, for example, and bringing them out to listen to them in secret. And so the internet, in a certain kind of way, helps to continue that legacy. At the same time, the researcher in me realizes how illusory the internet is. It feels in certain ways like it's a kind of eternal archive. But in many ways, it's not. It's not as much as we wish it might be, perhaps. And so these are some of the sorts of challenges. And of course, with the internet in particular, we often, we can find musical artifacts, so to speak, but a bit, stripped away of their sort of associations with people and, the cultural context from where they came. So again, it's kind of it's an interesting question, and I think it's one that we'll continue to have to grapple with. I think that the internet itself can become a site of sort of community boundary policing in certain kinds of ways. And I know that there are Kurdish scholars that have written on this. Joan Mahmoud's Kurdish Diaspora Online comes to mind. So I do think it's a very important question, and one that I'll certainly keep considering going forward.
Yes, I was in Mexico City, and I met an Iranian man who spent a lot of time in Kurdistan. And as soon as he knew that I'd spent time in Kurdistan, he was so excited. He pulled up Kurdish music on his phone, stuck it in a bowl, and we of course listen for hours, exactly like that, in the grand tradition of picnicking in Kurdistan. And I did want to note too that Marlene Schaefers is with us today. So I'm so glad that those comments came up, John, and so glad that we could all share that today. Christine, you had a follow-up to this question that I actually thought was really interesting. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, it was really, you mean the fake news, etc. Well, I've been wondering, where is the identity of radio now and the audiences? Is it online broadcast stations, or is it podcasts, or is it people who post to social media and post content? I just wondered if you could say something about the granularity of that, and if you think that the environment is very much affected by all the issues that we know apply to social media and online things like things like fake news and troll farms and bots and surveillance. Do you think that that is also a significant issue these days when it comes to thinking about the sorts of publics that used to listen to radio and what radio broadcast looks like now?
Yeah, that's I'm sort of thinking immediately about the concept of keshkol being a collection, a miscellany, often applied to poetry. But I've sort of learned or come around to thinking about the way people have sort of shown me Kurdish music and collated their individual playlists. And so in a way, I think we can sort of think about this collection as a kind of continuation of certain kinds of practices that have been ongoing for a long time. On the other hand, I think where things can get a little sticky is, in contexts where people's goals are multiple, right? I mean, it's a song theoretically has one message of its own, but it can be used, of course, in any number of ways to support any number of messages. And so I think, especially in terms of social media, sometimes it's hard to talk about, to get across the nuances sort of required. And in a way, this is why I've tried to avoid an overall Kurdish nationalist frame for my project, because I want to understand the ways in which individual people have affective attachments to these musics and these singers and are telling these histories. So I do think it's something we absolutely have to sort of keep in mind and be aware of, the ways that these can be used in multiple ways.
That's fascinating, John. I also, I mean, it's so interesting because the kashkuls are themselves pretty decontextualizing in their modern construction. In the 19th century, they're deconstructing, deconstructing context in a completely different way. But in the 20th century, the kashkul really becomes a way of creating entirely new books from scraps that have been saved. And so there, context is lost, context is made. It's in some ways a game of misunderstanding. I think the kashkul is a really interesting metaphor for the internet, because in some ways, when someone curates, even on YouTube, when they're trying to show you their favorite music, they're creating a musical kashkul right there. That's an interesting metaphor. I know you were just trying to resist narratives of Kurdish nationalism, but I know it's time to turn to audience questions. And the first one is actually from Mihraban, who's been very patient with us. And the question is, can you link music via radio broadcasting and Kurdish nationalism development?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Especially not least because it's not that I can just willfully avoid questions like these, right? They're central. Thank you. I do think it's important, again, to sort of point out that, sometimes musicians had individual goals. Well, they always had individual goals, but sometimes these worked toward certain collective ideas like national movements. Sometimes they didn't. I will say that I've often, it's not at all uncommon to find nationalist pieces of music, for example, so suruds, what some often translate anthems, broadcast on radio. For example, in Jaffa, from the Kurdish station at Jaffa, we know that there were several suruds broadcast. The challenge for me in sort of answering this question with the sort of depth it deserves is that I have not been incredibly successful in finding histories of reception of a lot of these pieces that might be understood as working toward a more a nationalist understanding of Kurdish music. So again, I'm sort of limited here, but I did just want to say I think it's a very important question, and it's one I'll continually be trying to sort of track down information on. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are absolutely moments where the nationalist motivations are clear and broadcast even in the very words themselves. At other times, not so sure.
Thanks, John.
Also, I'm sorry, it's also, I think, important to sort of track these histories alongside, which I did not do here today as much as I could have perhaps, alongside major events in Iraqi history and the relation of those events to Kurdish nationalist movements and to Kurdish populations themselves. So also, that's another major aspect of the question that the time won't permit me to go into here.
Thank you, John. I have a great question from Marlena herself, and she's somebody whose name I should have mentioned because she is doing some of the important, some of the most groundbreaking work that's going on in what you might call linguistic anthropology. I'm never quite sure whether she attaches the label ethnomusicologist to herself or not, but no doubt she'll tell me offline. But Marlene makes a comment and then has a question. Okay, she says, she thanks you very much for the wonderful presentation, as we all do. I really appreciate, she says, that you highlight collaborative processes in music making, the borrowing between traditions and so on. I wonder if you could comment a bit on discussions of authorship or ownership in this context. Are there any struggles or contestations about who then becomes the owner or author of a particular song when so many elements are borrowed? And how might ideas about authorship, ownership have changed with the introduction of radio as a media technology and ideas about copyright law coming with the modern state? She adds, I've been trying to think about this in my own work with women Dengbejis in Barkur, so I would love to hear your thoughts. As we all would. It's a great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. Thank you so much for it and for being here. I really appreciate it. I think to sort of start someplace I've already been, I suppose it is helpful on the one hand for me to sort of look at this question in terms of what contemporary musicians, music educators are saying about the sort of musical past. And so sometimes it's, again, in this example by Bokan Haurami, he says, he traces a specific, very Kurdish lineage of this song through Adnan Karim, through Hassan Zirek. And there are certain reasons for wanting to do that, I'm sure. And maybe one day I can ask him. But again, I think that's sort of interesting. And so I'll also mention, by the way, lots and lots of Kurdish texts, Sorani texts and Kurmanji on music are being produced now. And so it's sort of one of the challenges of my immediately upcoming dissertation work, the next phase, to start working through these and again, start understanding who's claiming ownership of not only songs, but genres, for example. And this is a really interesting question when we sort of think through it alongside the lens of regional musics. So for example, I'm told that the Kurdish maqams from Germian, for example, quite different from Kurdish maqams from other regions. And you'll find all sorts of explanations and justifications given. Some say it's because of the nature in Germian is different, things like this. But at any rate, I suppose my point is that I'm really trying to pay careful attention to the ways people are constructing their own histories. I don't want to just say this is the history, right, of Iraqi Kurdish music. I want to understand the way people themselves are constructing and relating to and passing on these histories. And so I'm also hoping in the future, by the way, to work more with music educators in various settings. But again, I'll also thank you for mentioning copyright. For contemporary musicians in particular, this is, it's a topic of much importance and it touches their livelihood. And it's, of course, not enforced. And a friend once laughed at me when I asked him about the possibility of copyright in the region. So again, I suppose all of this is to say that I really want to pay close attention to the ways that people themselves are sort of claiming ownership, staking ownership. Sometimes that means excluding others. Sometimes that means excluding bits of the past. And I don't necessarily mean that in a negative kind of way, but just in terms of constructing a particular kind of narrative. You're always highlighting something at the expense of something else. So I'm hoping to sort of develop in the dissertation, at least, a way of looking at these issues that broadens up and leaves room for possibilities and conflicts. I don't want to spell everything out neatly. I want to sort of leave room for these various understandings. And I don't think that's an answer to your question, probably as much, again, as to say that it's a wonderful one.
It's definitely one that we're thinking about. When I first moved to Kurdistan, I was so excited as a poet and a translator to see that there were bootleg copies of poetry books in the bazaar. I thought, like, wow, what an amazing thing to have a poetry book be in such demand that people would bootleg a poetry book. But on the flip side, of course, it means how are people making money? And then when you think about those patronage networks and the modern instantiations of them, the copyright cuts to the heart of why those networks are still so important and still such a part of the landscape. So it's a very live question for all artists in Kurdistan regions. Thank you, John.
Yes, thank you. I think I don't see any other questions in the feeds that I've got coming to me at the moment. So I think, John has set so many things in front of us for us to think about that I think I probably need to sort of go away and digest it, really, because he's added so much to, well, to my understanding, certainly, about Iraqi radio, and certainly the story about Jaffa and the story about the rival radio stations and people's movement between different places is really wonderful. Oh, hang on, somebody. Yeah,
yes.
Marlene replies to John.
I think we just set a panic into the audience. That
yeah, I think we did. Oh no, Argun's got one coming up. Hi, Argun, how are you?
From Argun, one coming in from George as well.
Oh, there are all these wonderful people lurking. Okay, well, let me just read back Marlene's comment then, her response to John. She says, "Thank you so much. I feel we need to have a longer conversation. I found Marilyn Strathern's work on authorship as the cutting of networks and relations quite useful to think through exactly what you say about how people write their own histories and genealogies." So I hope that you will get to have that conversation. I feel the need to organise a workshop coming on, I think, and we're all going to have to get together and talk more about these things. Would you like to read what George has to say? Marie, can you see that?
I sure can. George says, "My sense is that Iraq is having a moment right now where, despite the continued obstacles to peace, stability, and prosperity, Iraqi popular music, through broadcast and media platforms, has recently become prolific and accessible to regional audiences in a way that it has not for a long time, and become much less marginal, but attracts a great deal of admiration, particularly in the Gulf and the Mashriq. Is there a Kurdish thread woven into that phenomenon today? It seems like main global forums for contemporary Kurdish music consumption are dominated by voices from Bakur and Rojava, but the tables can always turn."
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great question. George, I'm also glad to know you're here. Thank you so much. So this is funny, actually. I was just listening this week on Spotify, don't tell anyone, that there's a new song out. I think it's by Iraqi popular artist Mohammed Es-Salim, and I think it's Gelî Love, who is born in Slemani, if I recall, and her family fled to Iran in the late 1980s, then to Europe, and Gelî Love eventually was signed to a music recording contract in the US. And there's a new song out with both of them together, which I find really interesting for lots of reasons. So I think it is really interesting to think about popular music in particular in Iraq more broadly, and how there may or may not be methods for collaboration. I mean, this is also something I think quite a bit about. I know there are those doing work on the sort of idea that the KRG, Iraqi Kurdistan, in some ways stands in over the last decade or so as a kind of representative example, again, some sort of corruption in politics aside. And so there are also ways in which musicians from Bakur, for example, are like recording their music videos in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Slemani, in Holer. So there are these sorts of interesting relationships happening this way. In terms of what this will mean more broadly, I've been sort of trying to follow on social media lately, rising number of protests, in protest of Iraqi journalists that have been killed. And over the past couple years or so, there's also really sort of impressive movements and discourse happening about gender equality. And I want to point to the Center for Gender and Development Studies at AUIS as well, and the wonderful work they've been doing. So again, there are all these sorts of movements happening in real time, and it's really interesting to watch them. And I would just say that I think they again, another train, that they again sort of seem to highlight questions of power, not least in terms of belonging to a certain kind of collective, and what that means and what that looks like and how that's translated, and how music is sort of used to prop up certain ideas about belonging. And it also becomes a really interesting space of contestation. So I hope sort of the possibility raised by your question, I certainly hope that that may be the case in the future.
It's interesting to think of the KRG as the sort of Baghdad, what Baghdad was for Kurdish music in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, maybe what the Kurdish semi-autonomous zone is now.
Yeah, and I've also done a lot of thinking about, you know, the show Kurd Idol, for example, that came out in 2017, and the ways that it sort of deliberately tried to situate Kurdish music in very broad ways, and yet sponsored by an Iraqi Kurdish company, Iraqi Kurdish orchestra members, and you know, conductor from Baghdad. So yeah, these are really interesting questions.
Yeah. So Christine, we have two new questions, one from Argun and one from
Amir Sharifi.
Amir Sharifi.
Yeah, I think I'll take Amir's if that's all right. So it gives me the opportunity to complain about Benedict Anderson again.
I was wondering if that might excite.
He says, thank you for your informative talk, John. You spoke of listenership as opposed to readership, which clearly shows the old dichotomy between traditional and modern literacy. Isn't Anderson's notion of the relation between nationalism and literacy one-sided?
Can I just say yes and then talk about listening public some more?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a really interesting question when we talk about music literacy. You know, as I mentioned, you've got Kurdish music being broadcast from all different parts of Kurdistan and in different, you know, dialects of Kurdish and different musical styles that are not necessarily sort of musically understandable outside one region to another, or this is not to suggest that radio listeners became such a cultivated public that they can, you know, sort of break down for you the theoretical issues. I mean, rather simply to say that, you know, Ali Merdan, for example, he's a great example, a Kurdish singer born in 1904 and was the first musician employed by Kurdish Radio Baghdad, and the first performance of his for the radio station was the Maqam Ai which is a Kurdish maqam from the region of Germian. And so again, I think it's when we think about musical literacy in a way that, you know, sort of allows us to keep in mind or sort of the greater context at play here, I think it's really interesting. And the question of genre, by the way, is also a really, really interesting one. You know, even nowadays, you know, when people show me their sort of internet kashkol of Kurdish music, I try to ask, you know, if you had to take this whole list and put it into groups, what would the names of those groups be? And it's a challenging thing to think about and talk about in relation to Kurdish music. But again, I think sort of musical literacy expanding again in a certain kind of way is really interesting and important to note. And again, also, you know, to sort of tie it back to Anderson's specific ideas about literacy, I think, of course, that there's not enough. This is not a very, the issue is not complicated enough, so to speak. I mean, we have, of course, a Kurdish reading public. We have, you know, Kurdish publications going out. You know, we also have Kurds who are involved in the literary nehda, you know, the Arabic awakening of literature, so to speak. And so, again, I do think that often these kinds of issues can lead us to make very narrow claims and highlight only certain concerns that really don't quite do justice to what's at stake.
Yeah. Yes, I very much hear what you say. I think that I once wrote a piece about Benedict Anderson and the Kurds, and I think my feeling was that although now, of course, there's a very developed reading public, it's just the order in which he describes it happening. You know, you get print capitalism and you get this, and then you get the imagination of the community through people all reading the same newspapers and things, and clearly that isn't what happens in Kurdistan. on your, I remember reading an article for that by somebody called Peter Wogan, who was critiquing the fact of literacy, that well, he felt that a lot of it was about how people read Anderson rather than what Anderson was saying, but he felt that there was a sort of implicit devaluing of orality and oral tradition and oral sources in the way that people sort of associated print capitalism with modernity and all this sort of thing. So I won't go into it now, but it is, you know, I think that this is a great way to, you know, critique, well, take the good things from Anderson, but also to critique the use that people have made of it too. Yeah, so I think, yes, I feel like Forrest Gump. That is all I have to say about that. But because I seem to, yeah, it's a question that keeps popping up whenever we talk about oral tradition in Kurdistan and Kurdish nationalism and Kurdish identity. Yeah, so
Hey, Christine, I do love the idea that John just said, it's not complicated enough.
Well, it isn't,
you know,
no.
It isn't, but it's such a wonderfully academic thing to say, you know, in a world where people are constantly trying to simplify. One of the things I love about Kurdish studies is that it resists the easy simplification. It doesn't fit into so many of these modes that we think we know, that we think we've established. It does require, sorry about that. It does require critical reception of all inherited understandings, knowledge, paradigms, and that's to me is very exciting about the field. So it's neat to hear you both talk about that. Shall we move to Argun's question and then close for the day?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so John, this is from Argun for you. Fantastic talk, John. It's a great privilege to hear you talk about your research. Can you talk a bit about the interaction occurring between local musics and the music that was being performed in the relatively early years of Radio Baghdad's Kurdish division? What kind of differences do you note between them in terms of genre and sound, especially in terms of instrumentation? What kinds of flow of influence do you see there, and in which directions?
Yeah,
These are just wonderful questions.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I'll go ahead and say I won't be able to answer all of them. Some of them are sort of lingering questions for me that I'm still trying to discover as well. I do think it's important to note in terms of sound itself, as I mentioned, a lot of the early you know, it's said that Ali Merdan, for example, once he came to the station, he was responsible for, and I believe this comes from a book by Bakuri, the Kurdish singer, about the founding of Kurdish Radio Baghdad. You know, he says that Ali Merdan was responsible for training the musicians who were mostly Arab and Jewish in those early years. And so, you know, to me, there's sort of a distinct sound in some of those early recordings in which the accompaniment, the intonation does sound very non-Kurdish. And the voice itself, not just language, but vocal qualities, for example, instead, in those early years, I think serve as a really important marker of Kurdishness in a particular kind of way. I will say that those sorts of, you know, I'm trying to say, from very early on, there were all sorts of really interesting kinds of music played from the radio. It wasn't just Kurdish music. So, for example, there, you know, Argentinian tangos developed and sort of hit the world by storm in the early 20th century. There are tangos that I've seen on radio schedules for the Kurdish Radio Baghdad, for example. There's a jazz band. There's time periods where they talk about Western music. So again, in some ways, there's sort of a very cosmopolitan approach toward the fact that this is a radio station in Kurdish. In terms of, again, to go back to sort of ideas of sound, and by the way, a good example, I think some of the earlier things recorded by Shamal Saeed, for example, to me sound very Arabic in terms of the accompaniment. I'd be happy to be told wrong, and if anyone wants to talk about this, we can further. But so again, that was sort of the case early on. Nowadays, it's interesting. I mean, Argun, I think you and I may have talked a little bit before about the fact that the use of So I don't quite know how to say this. I guess from east to west, let's say, Sorani speaking, heading over into Kurmanji speaking regions in particular, there seems this interesting case in which like the stringed instruments get bigger, right? So we have lots of saz and saz in the west, and I see more sitar, for example, in the east. Again, this is sort of a very rough generalization. So there are sorts of really interesting ways in which different regions have sort of taken up different sounds. And this is another question I ask, by the way, and many an Iraqi Kurdish musician has told me that the Sulaimani sound is very, very distinct from the Heler sound, is very, very distinct from Hauraman, even, for example, which straddles the border. So again, very, very important questions for me to keep considering going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for all you've given us today, and also for your really measured and thoughtful responses to the great questions that we've had from our listeners. Marie, is there anything else that you would like to add today? Because I think we're coming towards the end of our, well, sure. We usually allow an hour to an hour and 30 minutes, and we're coming up to an hour and 30.
Yeah, well, I just want to add my thanks, John, and also to thank all of you listening today. It's been an incredible day for questions, just incredibly thoughtful questions and revealing questions. So thank you all who are attending and participating today. And just to repeat myself, as usual, the recordings of today's sessions will be available on the AUIS and Exeter YouTube channels. So if you'd like to revisit anything from today, you will be able to on both of our YouTube channels.
And thank you so much again to Marie and Christine and everyone who's made this possible. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you today.
I admit, John, I was taking some notes because some of this is useful for my research. So it was a little bit selfish what I did here today. I was typing a little transcript for myself. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to everybody who listened to us and who asked such wonderful questions. Before you go, I'd just like to trail what's happening 2 weeks from now. On the 16th, we're going to be talking to Dr. Behruz Shamanara and Kakhersh Shirzad from the University of Kurdistan in Sena, that is Sanandaj in Iran. Dr. Behruz took his PhD in Göttingen, Germany, on the distinctive Kurdish folk versions of Shahnameh legends and texts, which are performed in the Gurani dialect. And Kakhersh took his MA in ancient language and cultures from Velayat University in Iran. He teaches folklore in Sanandaj, and he'll soon be studying with us in Exeter, we hope, for a PhD. Looking at the relationship of folklore and folklore archives with the Kurdish public and exploring what the future of this relationship is going to look like. I think that's a really important question, and I'm really looking forward to his getting to us and embarking on it. In 2 weeks' time, what I'm really looking forward to finding out is more about the University of Kurdistan's long-standing and unique work of collection, archiving and publication of folklore. They've been doing this for quite a long time, and they don't really seem to have the high profile that they deserve for this amazing work they do. And also I want to hear from them about the recent upsurge of interest and celebration of folklore in the Rojhelat area. More broadly. And I'm sure that some of you are likely to have questions about those things as well. So do please join us then. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and goodbye for today.
Thank you.